Hello guys, my name is Lars Stender. I'm a writer from Denmark who specializes in science fiction and fantasy. Today I'm here to read from my fantasy novel Madigo and the Hounds, and for those of you who want to learn more about my work, please find me on Facebook, Lars Stender. Madigo and the Hounds, Part 4, War and Love. Chapter 37. In the next 3 years, almost all of Madigo's time was spent on studying and working. From early morning to noon, Montero would cram magic with him in his big library or in one of the many laboratories in the castle. In the afternoons, Madigo would work either at building hutments for the many newly arrived Dracoids that were constantly pouring in, or helping Gorgas in Bloodstone's now rather large smithy. The smithy had been expanded along with the rise in troops at Bloodstone. The soldiers needed to have weapons and armor forged, and something always needed to be repaired. And it was for that reason that Gorgas had got more helpers. Some of them were blacksmiths from villages in the valleys surrounding Bloodstone. They had either been coaxed or forced to live at Bloodstone. Some of the villagers were part of Bloodstone land, and in many cases inhabitants were considered serfs of Bloodstone. For this reason, Montero could force them to work at the castle or for him, and if they were still refused, he would send his Dracoids to get his people as needed. And then there were those from faraway lands that had been arriving at Bloodstone of late. Some were recently arrived specialists, like experts in things like siege engines. Others were just slaves who had been kidnapped by Montero's Dracoids. It wasn't just the smithy that had been expanded. The bakery, the slaughterhouse, and the laundry, and almost all the other sections of the fortress had been expanded as well. Besides having something to live in, the many new arrivals naturally also had to have food, drink, and clothing. Being able to provide these things required more workers and craftsmen of all sorts than the number that otherwise lived around the area where Bloodstone was situated. Since Montero was very stingy, he would, at regular intervals, send small platoons of Dracoids out to the surrounding provinces to get craftsmen and slaves for the expansion of Bloodstone and his army. This, however, resulted in the emergence of a small city on the terraces that had been carved on the southern and eastern sides of the plateau upon which Bloodstone was situated. But even this was not enough. Soon Montero's army was so big that the surrounding pieces of land, villages and farms on the Bloodstone could no longer support the army on a daily basis. Something had to be done. Montero's solution was to send companies of his troops out on raids in other parts of the country. There they would rob or steal everything that they could get their hands on, and what they considered to be useful. This included corn and cattle, chickens and poultry, hay and straw, fish and grapes, fruit and wine, eggs and vegetables, carriages and work animals, pots and pans, flax and linen, tools and rope, and, of course, all the money they could shake out of the unlucky people they encountered. In the beginning, the Dracoids would only attack smaller communities and villages, but they soon felt strong enough to attack towns and even a large city. One of the cities was named Brookhaven, and it lay south of Bloodstone and took several days to reach. But that didn't intimidate Montero's soldiers. A whole battalion of them, almost 500 Dracoids, took off for the city and attacked on one early morning just before sunrise. The city had defense forces, a kind of home guard, but it wasn't able to give the well-trained and ruthless Dracoids any form of efficient resistance. When the sun set, Brookhaven was in flames, and those of the inhabitants who had survived the attack were led back to Bloodstone in chains to live as slaves under Montero. Montero celebrated a successful attack at Brookhaven with a great feast. The great hall was decorated with flags and garlands that seemed to float magically without any formal support or bindings, and guests arrived from distant towns and castles which Madigo had never heard of before. At first, Madigo couldn't fathom what these people had to do with Bloodstone or his uncle. But then Montero got up suddenly to say that the first class of initiates had now completed their training and were ready to leave Bloodstone the next day. They would go back with the special invited guests to live with them and in that way restore magic and order into the world, as promised. The message was received with great cheers by everyone in the hall except for Madigo, who kept it himself in the background. It wasn't so hard to do, since none of the other wizard apprentices seemed to want to have anything to do with him. Not even, or rather especially, not Caspar and Jasper. Madigo had carefully tried to talk with them at the party's start, and even though they hadn't directly turned their backs on him, it had been pretty clear that his presence made them insecure and uncomfortable, and that they wanted him to keep his distance from them. They had both just recently become candidates and were therefore sitting closer to the place of honor. However, when Portero made his announcement, Madigo noticed that their joy did not seem genuine. Helena didn't seem too happy either. She clapped dutifully, but her face seemed frozen. Even though her hair had grown pretty much out again, she hid it under a bonnet, and she looked pale and unwell. Hers and Madigo's gazes met briefly for a moment across the hall, and he was deeply shaken by the sorrow and lifelessness he saw in her eyes. He also noticed the black, tight-fitting necklace she was wearing. It indicated that she has been sworn in as an initiate. So had Grimwald and his two close friends, Alamut and Tago of Southfields. Tago had grown from a small, stocky boy Madigo remembered when he first arrived at Bloodstone, to a strong, broad-shouldered young man with a chronically lopsided and somewhat patronizing smile on his lips. Madigo still didn't like him after all this time. The only person who sent Madigo a friendly smile was Shaimet, but her mother kept a constant eye on her. In honor of the evening, they both were dressed in long robes of the crimson silk, their shoulders exposed, and their long black hair set up by jewel pins and barrettes made of silver and gold. The jewels flashed in the glow from the torches hanging on the walls of the wall, and the chandeliers whose magical lights could burn for hours without melting. Shaimet glowed like a dream in Madigo's eyes, and he was constantly looking at her. Shaimet was also one of the few at Bloodstone who continued to be nice and friendly towards Madigo. She would come out with food and refreshments to him almost every day when he was working on the construction site or at the smithy. She always smiled at him when they met, and her smile was like a shooting star in his otherwise dark horizon. She talked with him and asked him about his life before he came to Bloodstone. One time she gave him a hug, and afterwards his whole body vibrated like a bowstring from which an arrow had just been shot. He loved her and wanted only to be with her. He dreamt about her at night, and when they weren't together there would be a pain in his chest, and he could barely coordinate his limbs or concentrate on what he was supposed to be doing. After the dinner there was dancing and games. Madigo wanted to ask Shaimet to dance with him, but was worried he might embarrass her by doing so because he was considered an outsider by the others. He was also afraid that Shaimet's mother would reject him on her daughter's behalf. Sasira was clearly preoccupied with presenting her daughter to several of the foreign and distinguished guests that had come to Bloodstone that evening. But Madigo's heart was stronger than his insecurity. He finally built up his courage and began walking towards Sasira and Shaimet. He had reached halfway across the hall when Sasira, with an air of importance, took Shaimet's hand and led her to Grimwald's friend Alamut, who immediately went to greet them. Madigo froze and stopped in the middle of the hall. Soon there was an empty space around him, but he hardly noticed it. He just stared over at Shaimet with a dejected look on his eyes. She smiled politely at Alamut and said something or other to him that made him laugh. The next moment she turned her head and caught sight of Madigo. Her smile faded, and her face was both filled with an expression of surprise and sorrow that Madigo had a hard time interpreting. Both Alamut and Sasira was now also staring at Madigo. Alamut's lips twisted into a partially surprised and partially bewildered smile. Sasira did not smile. There was a thoughtful but also cautionary look in her face as she studied Madigo. For a long time the four of them just looked at one another, and for every second that passed Madigo felt how the delicate, fragile ties between him and Shaimet were severed one after the other. Eventually, the guests started noticing the silent episode that was being played out between Madigo, Alamut, Shaimed, and her daughter. The conversation died down and the dancing stopped. An unpleasant silence slowly descended on the hall. At long last, Sazia broke that deadlock by stepping in front of her daughter and Alamut, and gently directed them to the table of honor, where Matero and the guests of honor were assembled. Once she had made sure that the young couple were on their way in that direction, she turned around towards the middle of the hall to speak with Madigo. But Madigo had already disappeared. His defeat had chased him away, like a shadow driven up by the glaring flames of torches. End of chapter.
So we definitely skipped everything we were put up to in the other chapter. I was thinking about how did he come to know that they were turned into dogs when they left? That's kind of...
Yeah. He notices that there are dogs outside the castle.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees on some occasions that when the dogs running into the castle. But there are no dogs inside the castle. It's like as they pass through the gateway, they simply disappear.
Oh, okay.
And then when he sees the initiates and notices the dark frocks they are wearing, he put two and two together.
Ah, okay. So it's because of his life we didn't notice, but because of their, that makes sense. Okay. So we now seen him lost his friends, and now he get a new, but this time it's more to the heart.
Yeah.
We don't know anything about her,
Nope.
other than her mother is living there, and her brother, as far as I understand. And his old friends don't really hate him, but they're really afraid of what they're going to be put
but
into.
that's just a minute understanding here, because Elmut is not her brother. He's not Sharma's brother.
Ah, okay.
No, they're just he comes from the same country. as they come from.
Okay. So mother's trying to hook them up.
Yeah.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have his two old friends.
Yeah.
There's
Jasper,
like to be friends with him, but are super afraid because they're gonna lose everything they have.
Yeah.
That's how they feel.
Yeah. And potentially they also being warned off by some
Others, yeah. And his sister, we don't know much about.
Except that he has become an initiate now.
Yeah.
And of course that means that she is able to turn into a black dog whenever she wants to leave Bloodstone.
Yeah.
But also we can, from judging from Madigo's observations, is not a decision or a power, for that matter, that has that is pleasing her.
No. Because now she's put into another role where she needs to do things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's close it here.